This video is to go over the installation of my fuel kit. I now do all the assembly of the fuel kits myself, so my previous videos, which were mainly about the assembly, are somewhat obsolete. I figured since I'm doing all the assembly and the kits are really drop-in ready when you receive them, I should probably do a good video on doing the installation. So let me go over just some small changes since making my last video. One is with the fuel block, I'm now putting the 90-degree fittings in the back. So all you're reusing from your old fuel bowl will be the brass plug to hold in the spring and valve, and a Schrader valve, your Schrader valve on top, or a sending unit for your fuel gauge if you have one. I marked the compression fitting as engine. This is a 3/8 compression fitting versus the 5/16 compression fittings that go down on the fuel line on the frame. Some guys have been accidentally putting this one on the fuel lines, over-torquing it, ruining the compression fitting, and then causing themselves a delay to finish out their installation. The pump filter assembly is mostly the same. I changed to using the Bosch pump. Carter had made some changes that just didn't work well with my kit, so I switched over to using the Bosch. And those are the major changes there. One other change with the pump itself is the fittings. I found a nice fitting for the output side that's a single unit, screws right in. On the other side, it's a two-piece unit. I have to machine it. It comes with a nut that is pretty thick and won't fit on the pump, so I have to take eighth of an inch off of this thing, which brings it down to this very skinny nut on the back. But it's a two-piece fitting where the AN side of it screws in the nut side. The nut is split, so it comes off of the pump like so, and then this is for if you have to change your pump out in the future, and then you just push the AN fitting back on and screw it onto that nut on there. Some reasons I made the changes to doing the assembly myself is it's drop-in ready when you get it, so that saves you a lot of time. Second, you avoid some pitfalls with breaking things in there. You no more risk of cracking the filter heads if you over-torque the fittings going into it. There's no risk of breaking the terminals, the studs on the pump, by over-torquing those. Those are easily broken. And then I verify that the filters do properly screw onto the filter heads. Sometimes the screw on the adapter, the threads on the adapter for those filters aren't cut well from the factory, and then the filters won't spin on. So I take care of all that by verifying everything screws together. Everything else about the kit is pretty well the same. All the other parts are included. One other thing that I am doing now is I am pre-wiring. So I'm not doing a full wiring harness, but what I am doing, pre-wiring the pump. Again, that goes back to me saying that you can't break these studs down in here because I've torqued everything to proper spec. The black wire has a eyelet on it for screwing straight to the frame. I do include a grounding screw right here for doing that. You've got the red lead on there that will go up to the relay. I do include a relay now in the kit. It comes with a socket. The wires are color-coded, and the inline fuse that will come with it as well. Here is the wiring schematic. You can use this for reference later. I will go over it later as we do the installation. But those are the major changes and reasons why I'm doing the assembly myself. So let's move on and begin the installation. All right, first step in the process is to remove everything off the top of the engine. I started by moving the drain valve on top of the fuel bowl here to get it draining down so that it's emptied out, makes it a little less messy. When you start pulling things out of here, pull the fuel bowl out, you don't have fuel spilling all over the place. Although when you pull the drain valve, it all ran into the valley on this one to the back of the motor and down the drain that way. So I got a bucket underneath there catching that fuel. So coming out of here now, I'm going to pull out the fuel bowl, I'm going to pull the intake Y connector, and then I'm going to pull the mechanical fuel pump up out of there. I've got my other video that explains some of those details and tricks and tips and whatnot. So we're going to go ahead and exercise some of those, and then we'll be back here shortly as soon as I've got all this stuff pulled out. Okay, the hard part is done. The hardest part of the whole job, honestly, is removing everything off the top of the engine. So got everything out of there. It's my advice is don't clean it up just yet. As soon as you get everything out, you're going to be tempted, because now it's a cesspool down in here of dirt and filth from many years. Of course, you're going to have a lot of residual fuel from removing the bowl and the pump, etc. Don't clean it yet because you don't want to have anything washed down into the hole where the mechanical fuel pump came out. So you're going to want to just clean up a little bit around that hole first, get your freeze plug set down in there, and then you're okay to go ahead and clean up the rest of the valley to the point that you want to have it cleaned to. What I want to do now is go over my step-by-step process. Let's come over here to the table where I have all of the parts laid out. I wrote down step by step everything I did, and you'd be surprised how short the process is to get everything out of there. So first thing I did was I removed the lines that come from the front of the head to the fuel bowl, which are these guys right here, these two fittings here and here. That's a 9/16 wrench to get those off. From there, I removed the two hold down bolts, which hold the fuel bowl to the block, which is these right here. These are a 13mm head, and you would use a long not long, but a medium long extension on your ratchet. What you need to do is you need to remove those two first so you can tilt back the fuel bowl a little bit. It butts up pretty tight against the Y connector, so you want to be able to tilt back the fuel bowl so that you can then remove the Y connector. Once the Y connector is removed from the engine, you want to put rags, as you saw I had, in the intake openings and in the turbo outlet. You don't want any dirt or debris getting in those while you're working. From there, I then just cut the hoses on the going here to the fuel bowl. No sense in trying to remove them. Usually they're so hard, dry, and brittle, not really brittle, just hard, that you can't get them off. So just go ahead and cut them. We're not reusing them. Cut those off of there. After that, I unthreaded the driver's side fuel line at the back of the head. So coming over here to the pump parts, this is the driver's side. I was able to get a 9/16 wrench on there and just took it right off. Now in some of my other videos, I was saying to remove the downpipe or push the downpipe out of the way, but I got a little idea as I was going through this, and I said, geez, the reason is you can't get a wrench, a 9/16 wrench, down onto the fitting at the back of the passenger side head. So what I decided was, let me try to snip it, which I did, you can see. And then I got on there with a 9/16 deep socket straight onto the ratchet, and I was able to just reach right on there and just pull that fitting right off. So that took care of getting the passenger side fitting off of the head back there without having to touch the downpipe at all. So at this point, I haven't touched the turbo in any way other than removing the Y intake off the front of it. Okay, so after that, let's see. Cut the passenger side, and we removed it. Okay, so at this point, I'm just cutting the fuel lines close to the mechanical fuel pump so I can get the fuel pump up and out. What I did there was I used this little attachment for a hacksaw blade, and you can get these things at Home Depot. And you want to set them up so that the blade is cutting in a pull direction back towards you, not in a push direction. So in other words, as I pull the thing toward me, that's when it's doing its cutting, and not in a flow of motion. And then I just used it and got in there and cut the fuel line on both sides of the pump, passenger and driver side, and just cut it off. So now the pump is sitting down in the engine with its fuel lines completely cut away from it, close up to it. And then I used, again, the 10mm deep socket, and I got the two retaining bolts that hold the pump down. Now this is always the scary part, right? Getting that pump up out of there and still keeping the plunger in it. I got lucky on this one. As I loosened the bolts up, the pump popped right up, which means the cam was probably in the up position, the cam lobe for this pump. It pushed the pump right up out of there. As soon as I had the two lines cut close to the pump, I just gingerly kept wiggling it a little bit and pulled it right up out of there, and the plunger came up with it. So that's where we're at this point. So let's move on to the next step in the process, putting the freeze plug into the block. All right, I've done three things. One was I put in the freeze plug. I guess four things. The second thing I did was clean the valley real good. The next thing I did was cut the supply line to put the compression fitting on. And I would cut with your cutoff tool, or your little pipe cutter tool, cut it as far to this elbow if we look at the piece here, it was on there like this. So cut it as close to the elbow as the tool will allow, and that will have the AN fitting sticking out well past the return line right here. And then the last thing I did was here at the back of the head for the driver's side, just had to reposition the fitting down in there. Don't know if we can get back in here enough to see, but the fitting at the back of the head, as I show in the supplemental video, to angle it up facing that one intake bolt up in there. So that got repositioned. So we're all set now and ready to start putting the fuel block pieces down in here. Before setting the fuel block down into the valley of the engine, I'm going to go ahead and prep a couple things with it. One, we're going to remove the brass plug off of the fuel bowl. We're going to move that over here to the front of the fuel block. We're going to use the new spring and the new valve, as well as the O-ring that come in the international kit. We're going to move the Schrader valve, which would be right underneath the brass plug on the fuel bowl, and move it to the top of the fuel block. In this case, the owner has a fuel gauge in the truck, and this is the sending unit for that fuel gauge. So if you have a fuel gauge with a sending unit, then this is where you would put it in place of the Schrader valve. Then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take the two steel lines and snake those up underneath the turbo before setting the fuel block down in there. It just makes it a little bit easier to get those underneath there before setting the fuel block down in. And then lastly, to bolt the fuel block itself down, it's these two bolts that come in the kit. They are 15mm head, and they will hold the block, or the fuel block, down in the valley of the engine. So be back shortly as soon as this is placed in there. Okay, fuel bowl is set down in there. A couple things that I'd like to point out before putting the rubber hoses in. It's the only thing I haven't done so far is the supply line that will come off of the AN fitting that we put with the compression fitting here down to the supply of the block, down here, and then the return coming back to the original return line right up here. A couple things. One, it was easiest for me to get the driver's side steel line by snaking it in from the back side of the head, from behind the turbo back here versus trying to come from the front side up here. That was one thing. Second thing I found too was it's easier to put the return lines coming from the front of the head. It's best to tighten up the lowest most one, which is coming off the driver's side. Tighten that one completely. The passenger side one, just attach it. You don't have to tighten it just yet until you have the block bolted down, the fuel block bolted down to the block of the engine, and then tighten it up afterwards. And then the last thing is I in fact did not have to touch the downpipe at all. You can see the wrench back in there. I left it on the nut so that you can see the angle. It's a steep angle, steep approach with the wrench onto the nut for the fitting there at the back of the head, but I was in fact able to tighten it up without any issue really. It is a steep angle, but it turns the nut just fine. So the great news is really don't have to remove the downpipe at all as part of this process. So the only thing that you're taking off the turbo is the intake Y adapter, and that's it. Nothing else about the turbo gets disturbed. So this is where I'm at. I'm going to go ahead and put the two rubber lines now, supply line and return line, onto the fuel block, and then the top of the engine is 100% complete. Just did an installation on a truck with a stock downpipe, the Cobra head type downpipe on it, and I found the same results as with that aftermarket downpipe on the other one. Again, I used the 9/16 socket after snipping the fuel line to the passenger side head. Might be wondering, why don't I just try to get the wrench on there and just break it loose with the wrench? The problem is the wrench again comes in at such a steep approach, such a steep angle onto the nut, that you just can't quite get the leverage you need to break the old one loose. The old one, the bush of the rubber seal in there is so swollen, been in there so long, that it takes a little bit more than the wrench at that angle to break it loose. So again, I did the same thing. I snipped the brake line, or the fuel line back there, put the 9/16 steep socket on it, took the old one off, and then you can see I got the wrench down in there. Again, with the wrench, I'm able to tighten up the new line on there without any problem. So this trick works for both the aftermarket downpipe and the stock downpipe on there. All right, now we're underneath the truck. We're going to get ready to mount the pump filter assembly. And the first question I get always is which of the two fuel lines to cut. So you've got two up there on the rail along with the brake line. You've got the supply line going up to the engine. And then you've got the return line coming back to the tanks. So we're going to cut in after the selector valve, which is located right back here behind the fuel tank. So you do retain the use of both tanks because we're cutting in after the selector valve. And so the question is which of the two lines to cut, which is the supply line. So what we do is we follow them up to the front of the engine, or up to the front of the frame here, where they will transition up there. You can see the little connectors. They transition to hoses between the frame and the engine. One is blue and the other is gray. The one that we're going to cut into, see if I can hold everything here, the phone, the light, and point to where I'm talking. So right here, these two lines, right up in here, you see the topmost one there is gray. I had to wipe it off because it's covered in undercoating. And the bottom one, which you can't see, it's a little more forward, is blue. So it's the bottom line here, the one that's a blue hose between the frame and the engine. That's the one we need to cut into. That is the supply line. So what I'm going to do is take roughly a 12-inch section coming back here again behind the transfer case. I'm going to cut roughly a 12-inch section out of the blue line, or the line that transitions to a blue hose up there, and insert the pump and filter assembly. Now this is a 4-door truck, so I got plenty of room between transfer case and the selector valve back there. Extended cabs, you have a lot of room as well. Regular cabs, 4-wheel drive, that's where you run into trouble. And what happens is guys have to mount the pump and filter assembly on the other side of the frame rail and gingerly work their way around the brake line cable, getting it in between the bracket, between the pump, etc. It fits, it works. It's just a little more challenge with a regular cab truck that's 4-wheel drive. So let me go ahead and get this thing mounted up in here, and we'll be back in just a few minutes. Okay, short little interlude here, mocking things up. This is the pump filter assembly, sitting up against the frame rail with one U-bolt holding it, just so I can sort of get its position. I'm going to have it nice and close up against the back of the transfer case here, and what I want to do now is figure out where I want to trim the hoses to. Remember, I send these hoses as 18 inches and they don't have the hose fitting on the one end, so that you can sort of get them to the right length that you want. What I ended up doing was cutting 28 inches out of the supply line, the steel line on the frame. I took down the plate underneath the transfer case to give me a little bit more room to work. I cut the line up in here, right here, if the light shows that. So I'm going to mark this hose right about where I want to cut it, right there. That's the hose headed forward, and then I'll cut the hose coming back here. Right now I've got the line that comes off of the selector valve tucked up high so that it doesn't continue to leak fuel as I'm going through the process here. But just wanted to explain briefly where and how I'm going to set up the pump. So I'll come back as soon as I have this thing fully tied in and show the finished installation. Okay, here we are, all installed, buttoned up real tight. Everything is finished under here. I guess the only thing worth noteworthy is at the very top of the bracket up there, you can see I rounded off the one corner here in the back left, and I had to notch the bracket at the very top for that one piece of the cab crossmember bracket attached to the floor there. So here is the compression fitting, the 5/16 compression fitting on the supply line headed up to the engine, attached to the hose that comes over here to the pump and filter assembly. From there, as I mentioned, I had cut the supply line ahead of the transfer case up here, and you can see there is the 5/16 compression fitting up there as well on the line, running up to the engine. Again, that's the one that runs up and transitions as a blue hose between the frame and the engine. So I attached the wire, the red lead. I attached the ground lead to the frame. The hole to drill for that is a 7/32 hole. The screw that I supply is a self-tap, so just drill the hole 7/32, and then you can run the screw straight into that. the connection right here. I soldered that connection, and I use a watertight shrink tubing over the top of that. And I have test run the pump by just connecting it directly to the battery and letting it run for 10 minutes, looking for any leaks between the pump setup down here and the engine components on top of the motor, and no leaks. So I'm ready to go ahead and start the electrical part of the installation. First thing we need to do is pull the bowl wiring harness off the old fuel bowl. We're going to use the fuel bowl heater wire, which is this guy right here. He's red with a green trace, to trigger the relay, which is over here. And again, referencing our document here, it's the white wire on the relay that will be triggered by the bowl heater wire, which is that red with the green trace wire. One thing to note, again, as I've said it in my supplemental video, the IPR, the injection pressure regulator, is also part of this wire harness, so you have to be sure to plug this back in again to the IPR on the back of the high pressure oil pump. If you don't do that, you won't have high pressure oil, and therefore the injectors won't fire and the engine won't start. One thing to note too about this connector, you can see this one has been replaced before. The wires here generally get wore out from diesel fuel being spilled on them each time the filter is changed in this thing, and it causes the insulation on those wires to sort of melt and then become bare wires down here, and they end up touching, and when they do, a lot of times your engine will run funny or not run at all. So make sure this is good and clean, and there's no bare wire showing inside of this connector. So let me go ahead, I'll get this thing pulled off of here. I'm going to go over to the truck and do the installation of it, and then I'll come back after that and review it. Again, we're just going to be following this wire diagram right here as the installation, and I'll show you how I made my connections. Alright, so not a whole lot to show as far as the finishing of the wiring goes. I mean, that paper diagram I have is what explains it all. Here's where I decided to mount the relay. It's in the furthest back corner there behind the brake booster. I guess a couple things to note. I took the trigger wire from off the old fuel bowl harness down in here and ran it, this is it right here, this red wire, and just ran it along the engine harness wire that comes back to the plug over here by the fuse box. Ran that to the white trigger wire on the relay itself, and then of course the blue wire off the relay comes down to an inline fuse, which is right here. That's a 15 amp fuse. That runs down to the pump, and then for the battery hookup, the yellow wire on the relay, what I did is I just made a short loop over here to the fuse box itself. Right underneath this cover on the back of the fuse box is the stud where the batteries come to, and I just used a 5/16 I outlet, round outlet on the end of that wire for that yellow wire on the relay, and connect it here rather than bring it all the way back to the batteries themselves, just so you don't have the extra wires attached at the battery itself. This way it's all tucked neatly back in there. Nobody would be any the wiser to know that there's even a relay tucked in there that didn't come with the truck originally. So I'll tuck those wires down in there just a little bit tighter so that they're not seen, and then that completes the installation. So I will, if you notice, I had unhooked the glow plug relay. That's just so I could turn the key, run the pump, make sure everything worked on the relay without running the glow plugs themselves. So I'll hook that back up, I'll put the engine cover back on this thing, and this installation is complete.